Hello, everybody. It is now 7 o'clock, and I want to welcome you to tonight's program. We're going to have a great evening with John. And before we start, I'd like to do a little bit of housekeeping. This program is being recorded and uploaded to the Sonoma County Library's YouTube channel. I'll send a link to all of you so that you can know exactly where you can find it, but the YouTube channel is something you should know about and should definitely take a look at. I also want to remind you that we love getting your questions throughout the presentation. If something comes up, please feel free to ask them. You can answer them into the Q&A portion, or you can even send me a private chat if there's a question that you're not sure how to word it or whatever. We will do Q&A right at the end of the session, so when John is done. Let's see, this program, our second in our PHR Presents, Petaluma History Room Presents, is co-sponsored with the Petaluma Historical Library and Museum. The link between today's public library and the Historical Library and Museum are intertwined with the very history of Petaluma itself. The Historical Library was brought to Petaluma through Andrew Carnegie's program of library building throughout the country, and the hard work of the women and the men who created the library space for all Petaluma citizens. Today, the museum houses permanent displays on Petaluma poultry, dairy, and Miwok history while providing a robust rotating series of exhibits all year long. We're so pleased to partner together to bring tonight's guest historian, John Sheehy. John is a fourth-generation Petaluma native, living in the family home where his great-grandfather settled in 1863 on Sonoma Mountain. He's been an editor and publisher at magazines such as Time Incorporated, The Utne Reader, Fast Company, and Dwell. He's the co-author with photographer Scott Hess of the book On a River Winding Home, Stories and Visions of the Petaluma River Watershed, which was awarded the Gay LeBaron Editors Award in 2019 from the Sonoma County Historical Association. We love having John share his stories with us on the interesting and always compelling history in Petaluma. This time, however, we're going to hear how women who worked diligently to procure the right to vote within a backdrop of politics, whiskey, and prohibition. John, are you there? The stage is yours.
I am almost there.
Excellent.
Give me a minute.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Connie. And thanks to Paula Freund and Catherine Reinhardt for inviting me to give this talk as part of their Suffrage Centennial exhibit that's currently on display, at least virtually, at the Petaluma Historical Museum. On a Saturday morning last year, before the current pandemic hit, I came upon a member of the Petalumans of yesteryear, Susan Coolidge, dressed in a Victorian garb and delivering a very spirited talk about temperance right across the street from the water fountain beneath the town clock in Petaluma. She was portraying a local turn-of-the-century character and explaining how in 1891, when Petaluma reportedly had 50 bars, or one for every 60 residents, the Women's Christian Temperance Union erected the fountain as an alternative for men looking to quench their thirst at the saloons. Etching into its side the message, total abstinence is the way to handle the alcohol problem. It was an entertaining tale that well captured the image of Petaluma as this rowdy 19th century river town and the civilizing influence of the women of the WCTU. But as we all know, that's not quite how the story played out. Once the WCTU's dream of prohibition was imposed upon Petaluma and the rest of the country in 1920, it proved to be an absolute disaster, driving alcohol consumption underground into speakeasies and generating many unintended consequences, including the rise of organized crime, corruption of public officials, and a widespread disrespect for the law. But perhaps most surprising at all, it permitted women previously banned from drinking in public saloons to join the party and drink to their heart's content. In particular, a new generation of young women, recently empowered by the right to vote thanks to ratification of the 19th Amendment a year after Prohibition was imposed, were inspired to toss off their corsets, bob their hair, shorten their skirts, and bucking all conventions of acceptable Victorian behavior, come into their own as flappers, imbibing cocktails and dancing to jazz tunes in speakeasies with an abandon never before seen by American women. That taste of personal liberation, along with Margaret Sanger's coinciding launch of the Birth Control League and a number of birth control clinics set up, inspired many of these women to energetically push against the barriers of economic, political, and sexual freedom for women at the time. My talk this evening turns on Prohibition and the unintended liberating effect it had on a generation of women, freeing them from their Victorian pedestal of moral purity. Viewed by many at the time as outrageous, immoral, or even downright dangerous, the so-called sex-crazed kid sisters of the suffragists, they are now considered the first generation of truly independent American women, thanks in large part to the unusual convergence of suffrage and prohibition. But first, let me set the stage with some background on Prohibition itself, especially as it played out in Petaluma. My story opens in 1932, as the country is entering its third year of the Great Depression. Republican President Herbert Hoover is being challenged for re-election by Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt is calling for the government to take a major role in ending the Depression with his New Deal plan, whereas Hoover believes the economy should be left to improve on its own. Now, one of their main wedge issues is prohibition. Designated by Hoover as the country's noble experiment, it has been the law of the land since 1919, when the 18th Amendment was ratified. Hoover strongly supports its continuance. Roosevelt, on the other hand, favors its appeal, looking to restore to the federal treasury billions of dollars in lost tax revenues that alcohol sales had generated prior to Prohibition, money that is now lining the pockets of bootleggers. But taxes aren't the only reason people are calling for Prohibition's repeal. In Petaluma, the city's former mayor, Dr. Harry Gossage, has signed a national resolution along with 41 other prominent Sonoma County physicians, calling for the decriminalization of wine and beer as a means of, 1, restoring respect for the law, 2, reducing the health threats of unregulated alcohol, and 3, providing, in quote, a great moral benefit to the nation, unquote. Ironically, morality is exactly what has brought the country to this major divide. The Dries, or Prohibition advocates as they're called, decried alcohol as the root cause of all societal evils, including laziness, promiscuity, violence, crime, and poverty. Eliminate the drink, they claimed, and Americans will be happier, healthier, and more prosperous. While they acknowledged that giving up booze wouldn't be easy, they contended that after some initial resistance, people would reconcile themselves to a world without alcohol and quickly come to value its moral impact on life. They also predicted that once the generation of habitual drinkers had died off, a new generation of young people would have grown up not even knowing what liquor was. Well, they sadly misjudged the youth of America, for as Mark Twain tells us, it is the prohibition that makes anything precious. The temperance movement began in the 1820s and 30s as part of a religious revival sweeping America called the Second Great Awakening. It was largely led by men until the 1870s, when the Women's Christian Temperance Union was created. Petaluma women were at the forefront of the WCTU movement in California, forming the state's first chapter in 1879, and soon after hosting the first statewide convention and welcoming to town the organization's dynamic national president, Frances E. Willard. Now, Willard, under the slogan, "Do Everything," pursued a range of social reforms in addition to temperance, including children's education, orphanages for street children, asylums for women, equal pay for equal work, and raising the age of sexual consent from 10 to 16. She also forged an alliance with the women's suffrage movement in hopes that women would one day be able to advance those social reforms at the ballot box, using, in her words, the ballot as a bayonet. To appeal to her more conservative members who believed that a woman's place should remain in the home and not in the dirty realm of politics, Willard advocated for temperance as a means of home protection against the tyranny of drinking men. Following Willard's death in 1898, the National WCTU dropped its support of suffrage, refocusing its efforts strictly on home protection and maintaining what they called the social purity of women. In turn, the national suffrage leaders like Susan B. Anthony sought to distance themselves from the temperance movement, as the movement had created too many enemies among men for women's suffrage. I should note that Petaluma's WCTU chapter retained its support of the suffrage movement right up until 1911, when women won the right to vote in California. Also, although women nearly doubled the number of voters in the state at that time, two state propositions calling for prohibition of liquor, one in 1914 and the other in 1916, were soundly defeated, indicating that California women were not single-issue voters when it came to the issue of alcohol. The temperance movement itself didn't really gain national momentum until the 1890s, when a group of men formed the Anti-Saloon League, pushing the WCTU to the sidelines, literally. Unlike Francis Willard, the League focused on one single goal: getting rid of alcohol. The Anti-Saloon League will turn out to be the most effective political group in American history, setting a model for the way politics are still practiced today. Composed primarily of Methodists and Baptists, the League was well-funded and highly organized, with a massive printing operation in Ohio that churned out 300 tons of propaganda each month. They effectively turned alcohol into a political wedge issue in the country, threatening politicians in every state with retribution from their Christian voter base if they opposed prohibition. They focused their attacks on the beer, wine, and liquor industries, in the belief that alcohol was a drug being pushed upon Americans, and that once you eliminated the pusher, people would stop drinking, as temperance, in their view, was the natural state of human beings. But what they chose not to recognize was that while excessive drinking was indeed a serious problem in the country, especially among the working class, social scientists viewed alcoholism as symptomatic of deeper underlying conditions produced at the time by the massive industrialization, urbanization, and immigration that was transforming the country, bringing with it overcrowding, harsh working conditions, crime, and poverty. For all their talk of a moral movement to save people from alcohol by getting rid of the saloon, what the Anti-Saloon League and their allies in the WCTU were really worried about was who the saloon catered to: immigrants flooding the country at the turn of the century. That was certainly true of the temperance movement here in Petaluma. Having been settled in the 1850s and 60s primarily by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from New England, Petaluma experienced waves of immigrants beginning in the 1860s with the Irish, including my local ancestors, followed in the 1880s by the Swiss Italians from the province of Ticino, then the Portuguese from the Azores, the Germans from the Isle of Four, the Danes from the Baltic Sea, and in the early 1900s, Eastern European and Russian Jews escaping the pogroms in their home countries. While these immigrants were eager to begin new lives in Petaluma, they were not willing to give up their native culture, including the drinking habits ingrained in many of them. Drinking to them was not some moral vice. It was an integral part of their lives. Saloons, which in Petaluma were largely affiliated at the time with specific ethnic groups, allowed them to keep their native traditions alive, providing spaces where they could converse in their native tongues or read in their native language. They also served as headquarters for planning dances and festivals, lectures, political rallies, and funerals. But rather than view this as part of the great American melting pot, where all these cultures helped to make what the writer Pete Hemmel called a stronger alloy for the country. The Anti-Saloon League and the WCTU saw them as cauldrons of sin and debauchery. More worrisome to them was the fact that these people represented large numbers of new voters who were going to change America as they knew it. To stop them, they believed that immigrants needed to be what they called Americanized, beginning with shutting down one of their primary community hubs, the saloon. And for that, they turned in the 1910s to a revived Ku Klux Klan, who viewed their alliance with the Anti-Saloon League as consistent with their broader mission to purify the race of the nation. Now, once Prohibition was imposed in 1920, the government created an enforcement arm called the Prohibition Bureau, which quickly found itself under-resourced for the task at hand. To increase its rank, the Bureau began deputizing volunteers, including members of the Klan, which sent the Klan membership soaring in the 1920s during Prohibition. If local law enforcement could not or would not do their duty, which was the case in towns like Petaluma, where most of them were paid off to look the other way, the Klan stepped in, violently raiding distilleries, speakeasies, and even private homes. Not surprisingly, they targeted those identified as their enemies, Catholics, Jews, and Blacks. In Petaluma, the Klan made its presence well known by staging a large cross burning out near the Petaluma adobe in 1925. In January of 1919, the Anti-Saloon League was able to claim victory when the 18th Amendment imposing Prohibition was ratified. They had beaten the alcohol industry by earlier helping to pass the 16th Amendment, which allowed Congress to collect income taxes for the first time from its citizens. Prior to that, since the time of the Civil War, some 30 to 40% of the government's income every year was dependent upon alcohol taxes. World War I also helped their cause, since most beer brewers in America were of German descent. The Anti-Saloon League used that to equate immigrants and therefore drinking with being anti-American. Now, during the first few years of Prohibition, as drinking supplies dwindled, the national level of alcohol consumption actually dropped 70%, raising speculation of a new alcohol-free economy. Real estate developers and landlords look forward to raising rents as seedy neighborhoods formerly anchored by saloons improved. Theater owners anticipated new crowds looking for ways to entertain themselves without alcohol. Manufacturers of chewing gum, grape juice, and soft drinks all began ramping up production to meet anticipated increasing demand. None of it came to pass. Although the overall American economy experienced a boom during the 1920s, Prohibition's economic impacts were largely negative. The amusement and entertainment industry saw a decline across the board. Restaurants failed as they could no longer make a profit without serving beer or wine. Theater revenues declined, including the Petaluma's Mystic Theater, which ended up selling out along with the other theater in town, the Hill Opera House, to a large movie chain. And the closing of breweries, wineries, distilleries, and saloons eliminated thousands of jobs across the country, including here in Petaluma, George Reese's U.S. Baked Brewery on Upham Street near Bodega Avenue. But the Volstead Act, which was the federal law that was put in place in 1920 to enforce Prohibition, contained certain loopholes and legal exceptions that law-abiding citizens quickly began to take advantage of. For while the 18th Amendment banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol, it did not ban the possession nor the consumption of it. And that included alcohol used in medicine. Once Prohibition was imposed, the medical establishment, and I should say the AMA right before Prohibition, came out stating that alcohol-based medicines had absolutely no scientific impact on any ailment that people suffered from. After Prohibition, they changed their tune, identifying 27 separate conditions that responded well to alcohol-based medicines, including anxiety, influenza, diabetes, asthma, snakebite, and even old age. Two of the most important prescriptions were a hot claret wine gargle for the epidemic of sore throats that lasted through the 1920s, and then hot toddies for the chronic colds that plagued the Prohibition era. In Petaluma, a plethora of new drugstores sprung up around town, some of them reportedly operated by bootleggers. Legitimate drugstores chains also flourished. Walgreens, which had only 20 locations in 1919, grew to more than 600 locations across the country by the early 1930s. Another exemption was for wine used in religious sacraments, which led to a surge in attendance at churches and synagogues, as well as a sudden increase in self-proclaimed priests and rabbis looking to legally purchase wine for their congregations. People were also allowed to manufacture up to 200 gallons a year of either cider or wine. That equates to about 4 gallons of wine a week for consumption exclusively in the home. Now, that was good news for the grape growers in Sonoma County, who prior to Prohibition were California's largest wine producer. While a number of small wineries were forced to close, larger wineries switched to producing sacramental and medicinal wines and to making chunks of what was called of dried grape concentrate, which was called wine bricks. Each wine brick made a gallon of grape juice. And they came with warnings on the package saying, do not leave the juice sitting out too long or else it will ferment and turn into wine. In the first 5 years of Prohibition, grape acreage in California increased 7-fold as wine consumption in the US jumped from 70 million gallons a year to 150 million gallons a year. Sonoma County was also America's second largest hops producer prior to Prohibition. And while a number of breweries had to close down, others transitioned to selling what was called near beer, a legal brew that contained no more than the 0.5% of alcohol permitted by the law. Now, some brewers marketed it as a health drink that they called cereal beverage. Other breweries began producing malt syrup, an extract that could easily be made into beer by adding water and yeast and allowing time for fermentation. And although home stills were technically illegal, Petalumans found they could purchase the parts they needed for making stills at places like the original Rex Hardware on Main Street across from Center Park. However, despite all the home brewing and the home winemaking, what distinguished drinking habits most during Prohibition was a switch from beer and wine to hard liquor, which by the end of the 1920s constituted nearly 2/3 of total alcohol consumption, almost a complete flip from what it had been before Prohibition. In part, that was due to the simple fact that spirits were compact and easy to conceal and transport, and partly due to the fact that the popularity of the cocktail, which prior to Prohibition had been virtually non-existent. Now, many people who didn't like the taste of beer, wine, or straight liquor found cocktails irresistible, especially women. The irony is that cocktails were served in speakeasies primarily to mask the foul taste of bathtub gin and moonshine whiskey. Regardless, cocktail dinner parties soon became all the rage in people's homes, and the social practice of the 5 o'clock cocktail hour was also born at the time. Now, given their secretive nature, it's impossible to determine how many speakeasies actually operated in Petaluma during Prohibition. But from oral accounts, there appear to have been many. A number of them had been grocery taverns prior to Prohibition, like Volpe's on Washington and Keller Streets. The owner simply sealed off the existing bar from the rest of the store and provided customers with a private entrance. Many former saloons, like the Mercantile Grill on Main Street, which my great uncle Will Casey, who was a bootlegger, his gang ran the Mercantile Grill in town. It's currently located next to Putnam Park, where Starbucks is today. They simply switched to being soda fountains, with the added treat for certain customers of mixing a little alcohol in with their sodas. And until the Coast Guard stepped up their enforcement efforts, Tomales Bay and the Sonoma coast, with their hidden coves and their close proximity to San Francisco, became a natural smuggler's paradise for transporting rye whiskey down from Canada. Petaluma area, with its rural dairy and chicken ranches, also became a major producer of what was called jackass brandy, bootleg whiskey that reportedly kicked like a mule, bit like a mule, and kicked like a horse. And it was made largely with sugar as opposed to fermenting grains for the sugar. To disguise their tracks out on the ranches to the secret stills, the bootleggers often wore shoes that simulated cow hoofs. Essentially, what Prohibition served to do in the 1920s was shut down a multi-million-dollar alcohol industry and put it in the hands of home brewers and craft distilleries all around the country. And as a result of their combined efforts, by the mid-1920s, national alcohol consumption had rebounded to 70% of pre-Prohibition levels. Only now, with consumption, came a major decline in respect for the law. Gil Hall, a colorful attorney known as Petaluma's Perry Mason, defended most of the bootleggers in town, including my great uncle Will Casey. And in one trial with an alleged bootlegger, he asked to see the bottle of jackass brandy that had been found on his client in court. After opening the bottle, Hall drank it dry and then claimed it wasn't whiskey at all. With the evidence gone, the case was dropped. Something similar happened in LA, where the jury asked to see the evidence in their jury chambers, drank it all. With the evidence gone, the client was let off. Apocryphal tales aside, the reality was that during Prohibition, drink-related crimes overwhelmed both the jails and the judicial system, forcing prosecutors to resort for the first time to using mass plea bargains as a means of clearing hundreds of backlog cases. The other thing that happened as it became more popular with the bootleg whiskeys, I've got a slight problem, was that bootleggers turned to finding newer sources of cheap alcohol. And that included wood alcohol, which was, when it was manufactured, it was denatured, which meant they added certain poisons to make it foul tasting, essentially. And what happened is that became more popular with bootleggers looking to cut their costs. The federal government decided that they would essentially double down on the amount of poisons they put into the denatured alcohol, making it harder for them essentially to extract it. So what happened then is that the bootleggers found chemists who would extract the poisons essentially in the bootleg, in the alcohol, and put it out in the market, and yet they did not extract all the poisons. And because of that, what happened is that a lot of people went blind or actually met death. And becoming blind drunk actually is a term that came to be because of this tainted alcohol. About 10,000 people during Prohibition actually lost their lives, including my maternal grandmother's first husband, from drinking tainted alcohol at the time. This is what essentially led Dr. Henry Gossage and other physicians to call for the legalization of wine and beer, essentially, because they were concerned that young people especially were starting to imbibe this tainted alcohol. I'm having just a bit of trouble here. I'm going to stop my share for just a minute, if you don't mind. Well, I think I've got some problems here with my computer. It has frozen up. And until it comes back, think I'm going to have.
While we're waiting for you, are there any questions that someone might have? Pop them into the Q&A, private message me, or send them on the chat. Either way would be great. John, do you want to answer questions while you're waiting, or?
I think I've almost gotten to the point. Hang on a second. I'm almost got it unfrozen.
Excellent.
The wonders of computer technology. Yeah, just give me a second here. Sorry for the interruption. Okay, well, I think I'm back. Great, it's opened up. So, as I say, Dr. Henry Gossage and the other physicians of the country petitioned in 1932 for the legalization of beer and wine because of this risk of tainted alcohol and the risk it posed to the young, whose consumption of alcohol, contrary to the hopes of the Dries, had dramatically increased. And especially in college campuses, as you see in this kind of stage photo by students, where prohibition came to be viewed as something to rebel against. The other unintended group of new drinkers ushered in by prohibition were women. And their new willingness to drink in public, or at least in the semi-public atmosphere of the speakeasy, owed much to the death of the saloon, whose masculine culture could no longer govern the norms of public drinking. Unlike saloons, speakeasies were co-ed. Public drinking by women and college youth helped to bring about social scientists, what social scientists called a normalization of drinking, which then rippled in other parts of society. For many young people, breaking one law, in this case the Volstead Act that enforced prohibition, gave them an unspoken license to break other social mores of their parents' Victorian generation. In cities like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco, a new generation of mixed gender and mixed race pacesetters were rebelling in speakeasies with innovative new dance styles like the Charleston, set to jazz. Thanks to Hollywood movies, tabloid newspapers, and radio, the new jazz age reverberated across the country like a cultural earthquake, shaking the foundations of even small towns like Petaluma. So the common perception of women's relationship to alcohol is perpetuated by groups like the WCTU, was largely an adversarial one. In towns like Petaluma, Victorian codes of morality, piety, class structure, social standing clashed with the image of an independent woman drinking in public. That fostered a stereotype that only dance hall girls and women who sold themselves as prostitutes entered establishments that sold alcohol. But women on the whole were never as teetotaling as the WCTU made them out to be. Many kept bottles of beer, wine, or alcohol with their kitchen supplies for use in cooking, or to be served with a meal, or there for the quick nip when their urge arose. The popular cooking and homemaking books of the time, like Mrs. Beeton's book of household management, which was first published in 1861, contained recipes for drinks like sloe gin cocktail, strawberry fizz, and silver sour. Other women relied on patent medicines or over-the-counter remedies marketed as medical panaceas for curing an assortment of ailments. Most of them contained significant levels of alcohol, usually in the range of 20%, leading a number of women into alcoholism. Now, regular women did in fact purchase alcohol from saloons, but those transactions usually took place at the back door, and liquor purchase was only consumed in the home. Around the turn of the century, saloon keepers looking to expand their market began creating what they called wine rooms, either at the back of their saloons or upstairs if they had a second floor, for a mixed clientele of men and women. Petaluma's Arcade Saloon on Western Avenue, next door to where Andreessen's Tavern is today, between Andreessen's and the Town Clock, was one such place, with wine rooms most likely upstairs. They had posted a separate entrance, either labeled family entrance, ladies entrance, and proprietors marketed wine rooms as an option for respectable people. The layouts often consist of a hallway with several rooms, each equipped with a table and chairs and perhaps a sofa, and enough space in some places for dancing to a gramophone. Working class women in particular began to frequent wine rooms, sometimes exclusively with other women on a girls' night out. For while most middle class women in Petaluma were consigned to homemaker roles, those from working class backgrounds were expected to both take care of household duties as well as work long shifts and often labor-intensive positions. At the new factories that had sprung up in Petaluma along the east side of the river, including the Carlson Courier Silk Mill, which was built in 1892, and the nearby Nolan Earl Shoe Factory. Authorities eventually grew weary of wine rooms due to the sort of carousing that is depicted in this image here, which often led to tryst and to violence, usually by married men who arrived to discover their wives with another man in a wine room. Wine bars in lower end establishments were often little more than glorified prostitution cribs attached to saloons. And so that put wine bars in the crosshairs of the WCTU's crusade for social purity of women. And in cities like Petaluma, they soon began closing down the wine bars. Additional laws were passed in the early 1900s, criminalizing women in spaces designated for drinking. In Colorado, which was one of the first states to grant women the vote in 1893, a Denver saloon owner decided to challenge the law, arguing that since women had been given the right of suffrage, they were entitled to the same pursuit of happiness as their brothers, including drinking in his saloon. The case went all the way to the US Supreme Court, which ruled that states had the right to impose restrictions on whom they sold alcohol to, including on the basis of gender and race. A similar incident occurred here in Petaluma in 1913. 2 years after California women won the vote, John Keller operated a saloon in the Continental Hotel at the corner of Western Avenue and Kentucky Street. Nowadays, it's the Chase Bank. Also operated a retail liquor store through a side entrance off the bar. One evening, he sold a bottle of liquor to a woman who was later found passed out drunk on the grounds of Lincoln Elementary School, which was on 5th and B Streets. Keller was fined an equivalent of $4,000 in today's currency and warned that a second charge of selling liquor to women would result in the loss of his liquor license. 7 years later, that would all change with the imposition of Prohibition. Saloons and liquor stores may have legally barred women, but speakeasy had no such rules. They not only changed how women drank, but they allowed them to move in spaces previously reserved exclusively for men. For a new generation ravaged by the carnage of the Great World War I, and the terrifying influenza epidemic of 1918 and 1919, the world had shifted. They no longer viewed life through the rational, moral, and orderly Victorian lens of their parents. Instead, their attitude shifted to one of irrationality, with humans viewed as neither innately moral nor logical in their behavior. It was, F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote in his Chronicle of the Jazz Age, a whole race going hedonistic, deciding on pleasure. For young women especially, the forbidden fun of drinking in speakeasies or private parties with friends represented a way of expressing their independence. But these newfound freedoms and redefined roles also were uncharted territory, and so they came with some new challenges. Female alcoholism, for one, became a growing problem. But women weren't just on the consumption end of Prohibition, they were also involved in the craft production. Digging up old recipes in their grandmother's cookbooks, they began making their own wine and liquor. Some women even started running their own home-based speakeasies called home speaks, in which they served moonshine liquor and perhaps put a record on the phonograph for some dancing. Some adopted cool nicknames, such as the henhouse bootlegger, who stored her liquor in a chicken coop. While it's not known how many women actually entered the bootlegging trade, of the women documented, there were certain demographic patterns. Most were mothers or daughters, like the sisters, the Fearmouth sisters here in this picture, who were trying to financially support their families. A majority were immigrants who felt justified in their actions since they had come from cultures that did not view the creation or consumption of alcohol as a moral issue. The great noble experiment of Prohibition was based on the theory that personal behavior follows structural change. Personal behavior follows structural change. And so that by changing the law of the land, in this case, banning alcohol, naturally change behavior, which was, in this case, eliminating the sin of drinking. But women succeeded in flipping that theory on its head, expressing in their personal behavior during Prohibition new freedoms that made structural changes to the long-held roles of women in society going forward. And once Prohibition was repealed, oh no, frozen again. And once Prohibition was repealed, they were not interested in giving up those freedoms, nor were they interested in giving up their hard-won cocktails. So with that, I enter into my epilogue, but I've got another computer freeze. And I'm sorry about that. Apologize. Maybe at this point, Connie, you could take some questions and I'll try to pull out of this once again.
Okay. Well, we do have a question or two here. One is, what happened to Jackass Brandy? Did it continue to be sold as a legal product after Prohibition ended? Does it morph into something that we might recognize?
Well, it did, but it continued to be sold illegally. So that in itself is an interesting story. After Prohibition ended in 1933, a number of bootleggers, especially in Petaluma, which became a huge center for servicing the whole West Coast all the way up to Oregon and Washington and Idaho, continued to make bootleg whiskey, Jackass Brandy, essentially to avoid taxation. And the big bootlegger who ran that gang was Charlie Garzoli here in town. He ran a pet food company warehouse down on a warehouse along the river, and that's where he hid his still. So Jackass Brandy continued to be popular up and down the coast for about 4 years until the feds finally ran him down and shut him down, essentially. The thing about Jackass Brandy, as I said, it was made for sugar. So they would import the sugar to ports in the East Bay below Oakland, and they would send down these cars, which they stripped out all the seats of except for the driver's seat. And they'd load them up with sugar and drive them back to Petaluma area, would take them out to sort of relay ranches and drop them off, and then bring them into town to Garzoli's still down at the pet food company. They would make the Jackass Brandy, put it in the 5-gallon tins, and then put them back in the cars and drive them back to relay stations at the ranches and then distributed them to San Francisco or up along the coast. So that went on for a long time. Now, my sense is that, as distillers came online again in the 30s, whiskey distillers, gin and whatnot, became a lot better than getting Jackass brandy. And as far as I know, it pretty much died a natural death after that time.
So where exactly was Charlie Garzoli's place? If we were to go look for it today, what would we find?
It was on Hopper Street, which is now Lakeville Street. So it would have been a little south of where the Burdell building is, where D Street is, along Hopper toward, headed down toward the Lucky Mall, somewhere down that area there.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. So you got to tell us whatever happened to Great Uncle Will Casey.
Great Uncle Will Casey, well, he got busted in the 20s, but he continued operating. His gang, called the Cree Gang, operated Mercantile Grill, as I pointed out, and they also had a rod and gun club down along the river near Haystack Landing. And they had card games and drinking and whatnot down there. And actually, when the feds came and busted him, the sheriff and the feds came down on boats on the river and made the bust at the resort. But they continued to, it was a whack-a-mole kind of game. They continued to operate their stills going through the 30s. So Will actually was the general manager of Hunt and Barron's, which distributed grain to ranchers around the country. And what he did is he drove around taking orders and collecting money, which was the perfect front for a bootlegger at the time, running these networks like the Garzoli network through all the dairy ranches around Petaluma at the time. So I think he got off with the one charge that he had, he and his gang, the Creole gang. But he was a bigger than life kind of character in Petaluma when I was growing up, essentially.
Oh, interesting.
So with that, I'm finally back, and I really apologize for this breakdown that I've had with the computer system here. So let me move into my epilogue then, which is that essentially by the time that Dr. Harry Gossage in Petaluma and his fellow physicians got around to issuing their appeal to legalize beer and wine in 1932, it was widely recognized by everyone, except perhaps the most zealot of the dries, that whatever the intentions of prohibition, the cure was worse than the disease. For more than a decade, the law that was meant to foster temperance, order, and law-abiding citizens had ushered instead in an era of intemperance, excess, and lawlessness. In 1929, one woman decided to do something about that. Pauline Morton Sabin was a wealthy, blue-blood New York socialite, the first woman ever to serve on the Republican National Committee. She was also a temperance supporter and a major fundraiser for Republican presidential campaigns in the 1920s. Sabin, however, found the hypocrisy of prohibition intolerable. She was especially repelled by Republican politicians who voted dry and then would turn up at her dinner table expecting a drink. She also had a special aversion to the WCTU and the way its president at the time, Elise Bowles, claimed to speak for all American women. Sabin believed that prohibition had failed and that it was the responsibility of American women to do something about it. In 1929, she formed the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform, also known as the Crusaders. Within a year, the group had more than 1 million members, twice that of the WCTU. Sabin and her organization began lobbying politicians, attending political conventions, and campaigning throughout the country to ratify the 21st Amendment, which would repeal prohibition. Her argument for repeal, much like that of presidential candidate Franklin Roosevelt in 32, focused solely on economic recovery. After 12 years, prohibition had cost the federal government $11 billion in lost tax revenue. I can't even imagine what that is in today's dollars, and more than $300 million in enforcement expenses. With the arrival now of the Great Depression, Sabin argued that those costs were too precious to ignore. The public agreed. In November of 1932, they elected Franklin Roosevelt president by an overwhelming margin. And a year later, on December 5th, 1933, a majority of states ratified the 21st Amendment, ending Prohibition. Speakeasies everywhere threw open their doors. President Roosevelt supposedly marked the occasions by downing a dirty martini and remarking, "What America needs now is a drink." With Prohibition finally ended, the word saloon virtually disappeared from America's vocabulary. In Petaluma, new establishments that referred to themselves as cocktail lounges, bars, and taverns, and who welcomed both men and women, sprung up all over town. They included Andreessen's Tavern on Western Ave, located within steps of the water fountain erected in 1891 by the women of the WCTU, with its engraved message, "Total abstinence is the way to handle the alcohol problem." Today, that water fountain stands as a monument to the surprising benefits of unintended consequences. Thank you all very much for listening in. And I apologize again for the problems with the computer.
John, thank you so much for that. I don't see any more written questions. I'm going to wait for a moment and let somebody type one in if they want. I had a question about your ending picture with the WCTU fountain is quite an icon in Petaluma. Is there a story around that one? Is there, just very briefly, is there, how did that come about? Do you know?
Well, yes, it was put in 1891, and it's actually been modified over the years, I believe. It's been hit a number of times. That was one problem. It was actually had a accompanying fountain that was on the corner of Washington and Main Street, where the seed bank is today, right in front of that. And it was actually, that was a statue of the Greek goddess Hebe, who, and she was topless at the time, which a lot of people thought that lured men to the water fountain to drink, essentially. But there was kind of a scandal in 1912 about her nudity. They put a kimono over her, and it caused a bit of a scandal in town. And she was eventually moved when they built the bank building that is now was formerly the seed bank, and she was moved to Walnut Park for a while, and then she was mysteriously put into storage by the Parks Department and never again seen. There are a lot of rumors that she's floating around town somewhere, but nobody knows where.
Oh, scavenger hunt.
Yes, and I think that even when the location of this fountain had a lot to do with the taverns and the saloons that were pretty much chock-a-block in that area there at Western and Main Street as well, up and down the block.
Oh, excellent. I've been loving looking at your pictures of old Petaluma, and someone does have a question in looking at one of the pictures that you showed. The question is the original Rex Hardware in that vacant lot that's now between Old Chicago and McNair's? From what you can imagine, when you...
No, that's not...
further down.
The original Rex Hardware, what's there now? It was on the corner. So it was further down the block. It was really on B Street and Main Street back there. There used to be a drugstore there. Oh, there's a pizza parlor in there now, but it's okay. Next to the corner of B Street. It's not Old Chicago. And so that was the location of Rex Hardware. It went all the way over to 4th Street. And they also, where Rex is today, used to be their warehouses. So in 1942, there was a massive fire that burned down the original Rex, and they moved over to their warehouses, which is the current location now. And of course, in 2007 or whatever it was, that warehouse also burnt down and they rebuilt it.
Yeah.
much in the same version of what it was. So
Yes. Yes. Catherine Reinhardt reminds us that the site we're talking about is the New Yorker. So that's the pizza place.
yes,
Yeah.
that's the pizza parlor right there. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that vision of the street of Western with the old hotel where the Chase Bank is. I think that's, I'm sorry that that's not still a majestic, large hotel there. It was an amazing building. Um,
Yeah,
thank
and
you.
that too
Oh,
burned
yeah.
in a fire in 1967.
Yeah. Yeah. Someone asked, was that at the vacant lot? It's been vacant for oh, what was at the vacant lot that is there now?
Oh,
You
that's next to
remember?
the McNair
Yeah.
buildings?
Yeah.
That was the Continental Hotel, which was one of the oldest hotels in town. It sat there for a long time, and it had sort of a notorious reputation as well.
Yeah.
Um, but more for prostitution, I think, in certain quarters up there. And I don't know about the bootlegging that went out the Continental, but it was like at the time of the turn of the century, it was like an SRO in town, essentially.
Yeah.
Very
Oh,
old hotel.
interesting. Sounds like there were lots of places both men and women could go to get their prohibited alcohol in Petaluma.
Yeah, and I think that, a lot of people, the coast, there were a lot of taverns, or like my Uncle Will Casey had this rod and gun club down the river, and people would get on a boat and go down the river, and then they would party and
Yeah.
dance and play cards and have a good time, and no one disturbed them. So I think a lot of that went on in home parties out in the rural areas as well,
Oh,
especially among the ethnic groups. The Swiss Italians were famous for that, of having big gatherings and whatnot. And I'm sure the Portuguese as well, and the Germans, of course, with their beer. So people just found different ways to entertain themselves. And that was one of the reasons why all the movie theaters and everything else kind of went into a depression, because people had all these secret new places that they could party, essentially, and entertain each other.
yeah. Oh, how interesting. Catherine reminds us that the bench at Walnut Park, installed in 1979, was the 100th anniversary of the establishment of California and the Petaluma WCTU chapter. So you can still see that. So I'm in for that. And someone else remembers that the WCTU prayer meeting held in Andreessen's on the 100th anniversary. Can you mention that?
Yeah, I think, well, I don't mention that, but I remember hearing about that and reading about that as well. So
I think we have stories to share.
there are a lot of stories that go around. A lot of them are apocryphal kind of stories. I don't know if they have a lot of basis in them. I mean, my great uncle Will, when I was a boy, led me around town, and he was one of the raconteurs who hung out the back of Volpe's, even when I was a kid, and he was known as one of the main storytellers in town. So, a lot of what I've learned as a historian doesn't really match up to the reality of the stories he told me when I was a kid, but they were a lot more colorful than the reality that I've read about. So.
Ah, yes, yes. And then someone does mention the E. Clampus Vitus group and how they were at the dedication of the fountains. So
Oh yes,
that's a story all in itself, that very group. So that's
well,
level.
when you go down this, the challenge of this talk really is there's so many rabbit holes that you can go down. There's so many
Absolutely.
offshoots of the
Yeah.
story, and I had to really bite my tongue not to go into some of the bootleg stories that I know. So,
Yes.
and try to keep on topic, but it's very rich.
Yes, absolutely. And the town has enough people in it that have ancestors who participated. And so we'll get those
Yes.
stories eventually. Thank you so
Yes,
much,
definitely.
John, for your presentation. Before we leave, I want to mention that the museum remains closed, that while the museum remains closed, because there are a number of interesting talks, plays, and performances in connection with the suffragette exhibit at the museum itself. Please go to the Petaluma Museum website, because you can get all manner of fabulous presentations and what have you. And a note to follow up, while the museum is continuously applying for state and federal grants, they are suffering financially and could use your help. So consider becoming a member, consider donating, go to their website and take a look at all the wonderful things they're doing. Also, be sure to watch the Petaluma History Room's future presentations. Petaluma History Room Presents will be putting on more programs like this in the future, online, and then when we're back in person, we will be doing it in person too. Be sure to check out the History Room blog on the library website and follow the Sonoma County Library Special Collections Group Instagram. It's at @SCL_history. It's really great, fun history for all. Thank you one and all for joining us. I really appreciate your joining us, and we'll see you next time.